Paul George has been a disaster for the Sixers this season. This entire year really has been a disaster, quite frankly, for the Sixers, but George has been the worst. The 7th highest paid player in the entire league is having his worst season in over a decade and generally just looking washed. And I'll be honest, I was totally wrong about this. You can go back and look at my free agency content talking about Paul George, talking about the Clippers. I thought it was a terrible decision, a franchise-altering decision by the Clippers to let Paul George leave for nothing. The fact that they let him walk over 1 year of his contract, not wanting to give him the 4th year on his deal, when they did it with Kawhi, when they brought James Harden back, and Paul George was where they drew the line in the sand, I thought it was a disaster. I thought it was a huge mistake. And I obviously accepted the fact that George has injury concerns and that the Sixers were taking a risk giving him that much money over that long of a time period. But I did not imagine that the Sixers would have been this bad this year and that the Paul George situation would have been as bad as it is. This is arguably the worst season of Paul George's career since he's become a high-minute player. You look at his stats throughout his career, obviously you have the year where he had the injury, but other than that, the only seasons that have been worse than this for him were his first and second year. And at 34 years old, things are not going to get better anytime soon. Really quickly though, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, PrizePicks. Now, if you've never done PrizePicks before, I've got a couple of things to offer you. First, we've got a Jaden Daniels free square this weekend for the NFC title game, so keep an eye on that. If he passes for a single yard, then you get that free square selection. And as always, you can use code SPORTING, click the link in the description for an instant $50 when you play your first $5 lineup. So for me, of course, I'm going to use that Jaden Daniels free square, but you can also combine that with NBA stuff throughout the week. Obviously, you can do football as well. That's one of the fun things about PrizePicks. You can combine sports. You can continue to take a look at all of their promos that they do every week, whether it be Taco Tuesday or Flex Friday, whatever the case may be. And of course, this free square, which I would encourage you to take advantage of. So if you feel like you have a decent idea of what may or may not happen in a particular game, or you just want to add a little bit more entertainment to your viewing experience with football this weekend or throughout the NBA season, make sure to check out PrizePicks. Use code SPORTING for that instant $50 when you play your first $5 lineup. Make sure to use that Jaden Daniels free square, and thank you again to PrizePicks for sponsoring this video. And for Sixers fans, this is nothing new. They've had iffy regular season teams before, teams that weren't particularly healthy during the year. Obviously, Embiid has had his fair share of injury issues throughout the years, but there have been teams in the past that have felt that way, that also felt like a real threat in the postseason, a team that you were still going to have to deal with once they all got healthy. That's not the feeling that this Sixers team has, and they're quickly approaching the end of the Embiid era in Philadelphia, and Paul George is right at the center of that. When the Sixers made this acquisition, it was clear that George was a perfect fit alongside Tyrese Maxey, alongside Joel Embiid. You've got your guard creator, you've got your potentially two-way wing if Paul George decides to play defense, a guy that can space on the perimeter, can be the third option for you offensively, is probably happy to be kind of a background third option guy. And then of course you have your dominant big man in Joel Embiid. It made perfect sense. And most people loved the Sixers offseason. They got all these pieces around the edges, around the margins. Yabusele was going to be really good for them, and they were supposed to be off and running, be one of the contenders in the Eastern Conference. And the reason that they haven't been good this year is obvious, right? They just haven't been healthy. Injuries have been a huge issue, but the Paul George thing is a real concern, not just this year, but moving forward. Because yes, the Sixers have had teams like that in the past that have looked a little bit dangerous in the playoffs. This team might not even make the playoffs. They're worse than teams like Chicago. They're not even in the play-in tournament as of the recording of this video. And that, you want to talk about a disaster season, that's the definition of a disaster season for the Sixers this year. There is still the possibility that they go on a tear in the second half of the year as guys get healthier. It hasn't just been George and Embiid. A bunch of guys have missed time. Maxey has missed time. And maybe there's a point in the season where later in the year, George finds his rhythm with this team because all the pieces finally fit into place. Embiid gets healthy, and we see the realized version of the Sixers team with Nick Nurse leading the way. But whether that happens or not, the Sixers have some decisions to make about their future, and it all centers around Paul George because they have not been shy about changing their roster over the years, whether it be back in 2019 when they let Jimmy Butler go to Miami, whether it be after the Harden era and they traded him away because he wanted to leave. They haven't been shy about changing pieces around, but the Paul George thing feels like the last real move that they could have made. He's got 2 more years left on his deal, plus a player option, which I'm assuming he's going to pick up. So you've got 34, 35-year-old Paul George having one of the worst seasons of his career, who's under contract for 3 more seasons and is currently the 7th highest paid player in the league. That's not Jimmy Butler in his prime going to Miami. That's not James Harden in his post-prime, who's a free agent who's looking for another deal that maybe you can try and get some value out of. That is a negative asset. That is what Paul George is right now. And then you add that to the fact that Embiid obviously hasn't been healthy this year, but even in the games that he's played, hasn't really looked like himself. He also just signed an extension. This core was supposed to be set up for like a 2 to 3 year window of contending, and then the last couple of years of these contracts might look like how they've looked this year, yet it's happened straight away. And this team is kind of like the Eastern Conference version of the Suns in terms of roster construction, a team that looks like it's straight out of 2015. You've got 3 stars, the big 3, and then you've got a bunch of minimum guys and some rookies and some smaller contract players around it. And that model just doesn't work anymore. And it certainly doesn't work when your guys aren't healthy and they're not dependable and they're not available. Now, as a counter to that Suns analogy in comparison, obviously the Sixers have more draft assets moving forward than Suns, and they have young players. Maxey's going to continue to improve. Jared McCain was awesome before he got hurt this year. I'm sure Sixers fans have been waiting for me to mention Jared McCain's name, and that's awesome. That's fantastic for you moving forward. It doesn't solve the George Embiid issue, because if those guys aren't playing, if the season ends for Philadelphia and they're the 10 seed and they lose in the play-in, or they don't make the playoffs, and you never really get an opportunity to see what Embiid and George look like together because they're just never really all that healthy, or in George's case, all that good, what's the point in using your assets and using Jared McCain and using Tyrese Maxey potentially and using the first round picks that you do have available? If you're Daryl Morey, what is the point of adding to this team when you know your stars aren't going to be healthy other than preserving his job potentially? And again, this was not supposed to be the season that this was going to happen for the Sixers. This might be a 2028 problem for them. Nobody thought it was going to be a 2025 problem for them. But at this point, you can't really say, oh, they've had bad injury luck. They've been unlucky with injuries. When you have Paul George and Joel Embiid on your roster, there's no such thing as bad injury luck. You're expecting those guys to miss games, and I think they just thought that they would be better than they have been. They thought Maxey would be able to carry them a little bit more. Maybe they'd only be missing Embiid or George, one of them at a time. There have been plenty of times this year where both of them have been hurt, or Maxey has missed an extended period of time. The other role player guys just haven't been good enough. And a lot of people's estimation, Nick Nurse as the coach hasn't been good enough. And it's all leading to this point where there's a real possibility we get to the offseason and the Sixers are trying to trade Paul George for whatever they can get out of the contract, whatever the case may be, and reset this whole thing again. Try and find another way to build around Embiid and potentially Embiid and Maxey. Now, obviously, there's a nightmare scenario here for the Sixers, or maybe it's a situation that some Sixers fans are hoping for where they're actually shopping Joel Embiid and they're just tearing down the entirety of the roster and they're going into a rebuild. And that would be potentially the correct conclusion to come to, but it would be a sad one because this was supposed to at some point be a finals team. I really believe that. The Embiid era should have ended up in the finals at some point. In 2019, Kawhi makes the shot, they don't get there. In 2023, they're up 3-2 on the Celtics and they blow the series. And there's just been multiple opportunities, whether it be in 2019, whether it be in 2023 or anywhere in between, that they did have a chance. Maybe Embiid wasn't 100% healthy. Maybe they had some bad luck with Kawhi making the shot. But the over-under on finals appearances for the Philadelphia 76ers in the Embiid era certainly was over. And I'm starting to think that they're just never going to get there. Maybe that's a dramatic overestimation of what exactly has been happening in Philadelphia this season, what will continue to happen moving forward. But I'm definitely concerned that because of the George contract, because of the potential inability to move that, inability to build around this team at all, that this era of Sixers basketball has just ended. And the thing that finally ended it was the signing of Paul George in the first place.